We now have half an hour, 25 minutes, half an hour for questions. So I'll open up the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. I guess I have a question for George first. The project that you described just sounds amazing. But I kept thinking that it seemed so disciplinarily a history project, like it was public history. And it sort of reminded me of the fact that here at Brown, history is not considered organizationally, at least part of the humanities, but of social sciences, right? So I was just wondering about that, the sort of, because Clifford brought up the sort of classics is not all of the humanities, like history is not all of the humanities. So to sort of widen out from history to other fields in the humanities, if you could talk a little bit about that. And then secondarily, like, I guess this is more of a concrete question, or a sort of question about pragmatics. Like basically the project that you're describing, I could imagine versions of that emerging in Providence in relation to Brown. So the question I have is actually, I guess, about infrastructure. Like what comes first to build, because the thing you're talking about requires a tremendous sort of material investment in building those links to the community. It requires faculty and grad students who are freely able and have credibility in those communities. And so, like, if one were to go about building that, what are the steps? Like, what are the steps that happen there in order for that to happen? So thank you.
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about where history sits. And I borrow from all kinds of disciplines. It comes from my American Studies training, whether it be the social sciences or the humanities. And therefore, we've had all kinds of people involved in this, in terms of Ph.D. students, but also in terms of undergraduate students. There's need for the digital humanities, for example, increasingly, people to have expertise there. We're partnering in this effort with Casa 0101, which is incredibly important. It was organized by Josefina Lopez, who's a playwright, who's the author of Real Women Have Curves. And she took her Hollywood money that she made from the play/film, it's America Ferrera's first film, and she invested in a community arts institution in Boyle Heights, basically in a theater that produces and classes for children, artistic representation in the theater. So it's all about finding partners who are legitimate in the community and who have made that lifelong commitment. So that's, I think, a critical part of it. And therefore, we are constantly incorporating art into our work, theater production. We are trying to, for 20 years, I have sent her stuff that I've written, and she's like brought it to life as a playwright. And so I see it being depicted in her plays. So we have a constant thing. The other part of this, and I think this is important, the number one thing that we have going for us is passion towards this community. And a diverse graduate and undergraduate population wants to serve it. I can tell you that each exhibition, when it was physical in person, was about $10,000 to $12,000. I know because I paid it out of my faculty research fund. It didn't take an incredible outlay. It took that partnership. We had community people who wanted to help us, who gave us incredible discount rates on everything so that we could mount the things. It didn't require a great institutional commitment on part of USC. In fact, I teach at what I now call the University of Scandal, given USC's own history over the last 10, 15 years. And therefore, while they were doing the scandal, we were doing this work in the community. And it took that passion and that commitment to stay there long term. That's the number one thing that people want. It turns out that that work has been recognized by the city council. And so, for example, Gilbert Cedillo, who's a city councilman who grew up in Boyle Heights, has already secured for us the beginning part of a fund to build an institute and a museum that would be in Boyle Heights for social justice broadly. He did that because LA Unified now needs it to help train K-12 teachers, and he's getting funding from a variety of places. So the likelihood is that we will actually open a new institution sometime in the near future that's based in the same sort of work. The money's not coming from the university. The money's coming from the community. You might know California just passed an ethnic studies requirement. Teachers to graduate now from a high school in California requires an ethnic studies course. And that's going to require more training. And so that's what we're building upon, is the fact that California is changing, and that requires new institutional pressures. I've never waited for the university. What I have basically found at my university, at least, and I think many of us who have, and I've been a dean, I've done all those kind of things, is I'd rather have the university try to stop me than have to ask permission for them, for this work initially. And so this is kind of, you know, my approach, and so far it's worked. It's worked pretty well. Now, I do hope the university supports. The university has a whole system to try to help people out in the community and so forth. But what I found is that they often are a kind of problems approach. It's a social scientific problems approach. Oh, there's diabetes in the community, or there's obesity. If you do a program to try to solve that, we'll fund you. But in terms of the humanities, in terms of the arts, in terms of things that bring joy and meaning to people in the community, that's not something the university puts as a priority. And I think that's one of those areas in which we have to show ahead of the university what we can support and the kind of progress that can make.
Thank you for those wonderful talks. And I think you've gotten us off to just a great start this morning, so I really appreciate that. I have two questions. One is for both of you and one is for George. The question that's for both of you has to do with Mellon, because you know, Mellon, since the assumption of the presidency by Elizabeth Alexander, has changed its priorities profoundly. And so I just was wondering whether, Cliff, you have anything to kind of say about that, because your focus was more on the obsession with time to degree on their part. And I also just was, yeah, if you have any comments about that. And the second question is for George. In your description of Yesenia's dissertation, I found myself wondering if the work within the dissertation, or the dissertation itself, is in a distinctive or separate mode than the work that you're doing in the community. Because it sounded a little bit to me like it was closer to the sociological approach or problem-solving approach that you were just attributing to the academic community and the university more generally. And so I was just wondering if that's the case, and if so, what do you think the reasons for it are? Do your graduate students share their dissertations with the community? Do they see their dissertations as co-created? If not, I mean, even if they're co-created, are there distinctive criteria and that shape their mode and form that is in a little bit of tension with the extramural work? Thank you.
I just want to react very quickly to what George was saying, only because both my family, I grew up in West Philadelphia near Penn, because my father was on the faculty at Penn, so I lived in West Philadelphia in the 1970s. And, you know, I then taught at USC, and now I teach at the University of Chicago. And although I don't want to praise these American institutions overly much, I would like to register the astonishing transformation of the situation of these universities in their urban context and their aspirations in that regard. We're not, Penn is not Penn of the 1970s, and Chicago is not Chicago of the 1970s anymore. That's been accomplished both by, I mean, profound, I think, ethical changes within the university, which are good. They're probably still all pursuing the kind of ambitions towards gentrification of their local neighborhoods that, you know, that did have and continue to have some pernicious aspects. But it is an amazing transformation. And I think at the University of Chicago, there are some very substantial and fascinating efforts at community building in regards to both history and arts production, and separately efforts at something like forms of remedial scholarship. We'll identify the problems. We install sensors to hear gunshots, and we go and study them and things like this. So anyhow, we're in an interesting moment. About Mellon, let me just say quickly about time to degree, about the earlier thing, that, you know, Mellon was not wrong to be interested in time to degree. We don't want people spending huge amounts of their 20s in graduate school if it's not going to work out well. And one of the other things I did on this thing is just add up the time to degree of the faculty at the University of Chicago Department of Art. Because when it became clear that the new funding model at Chicago was going to probably produce this effect internally, that departments would have or probably become interested in time to degree, they all protested, oh, no, anthropology needs this long time degree. You know, art history, with our need for students to go look at archives, art history needs a long time to degree. And the one response I said to them was the average time to degree of the people you hire is very much lower in every single department in the university than there, with that exception of like psychology. But in humanities and interpretive social sciences, the average time to degree of the people they hire is very much lower than the average time to degree that they produce. Mellon, yeah. I mean, I think the changes in Mellon in the last, I mean, beginning, including when Danielle Allen was head of the board, Mellon's shift in priorities is fascinating. And a great deal of it I applaud. I'll simply say that, you know, obviously the effects that I think I sense in admissions were some like unintended consequences of what Mellon was doing, and in part they follow upon, I mean, unfortunately for Mellon, it follows on scale. It's very hard to intervene at the policy level at these kinds of institutions, at the scale that Mellon wishes to do, and then to establish kind of reporting requirements of the kind that Mellon would like, because it would like to know effects. And those kinds of reports have almost to take the form of quantitative rather than qualitative form. It's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult to do in a way that doesn't have potentially pernicious consequences that are not only hard to perceive, but frankly also hard to document. I think the recent changes in Mellon are interesting. I think Mellon's direction of some of its funds outside the United States was also a fantastic thing. Its interest in the preservation of local archives outside the United States and in digital preservation projects in very small underfunded museums out there. I think the last 5 years of Mellon has brought its, in the projects of which I'm aware, a series of totally fascinating transformations. I could say more about Mellon in its interventions in the publishing world too, but.
So, my experience with Mellon, I'll go to the president before Elizabeth, which is Earl Lewis, who was one of my closest friends and colleagues. And one of the things you clearly see in the national foundations, and you've seen it in Ford to some extent, you've seen it in others, is the reality of the changing diversity of the United States being absolutely central to their vision of what the humanities will be in the future. I don't think that we've given that enough thought. I don't think we've thought about how that may change what they fund. It also may change their perspective. What is consistent about Mellon is this funding of the Mellon-Mays program. And let me just sort of emphasize that again. I'll return to that because that's a program I've run for the last 12 years at USC. It's a program I've been involved in for 25 years at USC. And it's hard. You're basically approaching sophomores and saying to a sophomore who may have just decided to major in a humanities field, and specifically humanities or what they call the humanistic social sciences. Have you ever thought about being a professor? Would you like to explore that? This is beyond research. It starts with research, but it then continues to think through what it's going to take to get you to the Ph.D. The majority of programs that do this as undergraduate programs includes, by the way, all the historically black colleges and universities, includes places like Heritage that is on a Native American reservation. It's a native where Yesenia went. You know, the going rate now is about 50%. 50% of the people identified as sophomores will end up in PhD programs. That's not a bad rate these days. And they already are producing hundreds of people who are faculty. So one of the things you see in the United States, because often of the pullback of federal funds, is that it's two foundations. It's the Mellon Foundation and the Ford Foundation, and their long-term commitment to diversity in PhD education that has made the difference for the vast majority of people who are entering the PhD and then becoming faculty. So if you actually look at the diversity in the humanities, the number of people who were either funded by Mellon or Ford is right there. And I just want to kind of, like, people don't understand this, and people don't often, like, I would, you know, if I was ever on a search committee and a faculty, I would be starting my search there. You know, Ford or Mellon funded people in my field. Because you're gonna find some very high quality people who have been mentored since they were undergraduates. And I think that's really important. I think my description of Yesenia's project is probably the failure here. Yesenia has an incredible commitment, and this is what she brought to the PhD program. It wasn't necessarily created by Boyle Heights Museum, and it's what she's now taken back to the place she grew up on the Yakima Reservation. So she has basically three populations she's currently studying. The native population that she's in constant contact with. It's the administrators at her college where she's now employed. It's the people in that neighborhood. The Japanese American population where she works with archivists and people, and then the Mexican population where there's a constant back and forth in terms of her interaction. I would say that it's that being in touch with each of those communities in her has really enlivened her dissertation as a whole. She has this incredible beginning of the Japanese American chapter on mochi making in the community, and the long-standing archival part of that, and then, you know, and that comes from community people in terms of activities that they point to as being consistently there in her community. And she's also at the same time dealing with some fairly theoretical, you know, everything from settler colonialism and how one thinks about that, and, you know, some theories that are floating around, and of course the, you know, racial relations theory now that has to involve more than two groups. It has to involve multiple groups interacting. And so that part is, and I think it's really true that you can develop students who both are committed to communities and to that interaction, and at the same time dealing with the latest theories and approaches in the disciplines. Those things are what these students combine, and I think that's a powerful combination.
Thank you guys, that was so delightful and delicious, and now I have a question about personality. And for each of you, it's slightly different. George, anytime we talk about the practice of public history in American studies history, you are a central figure of that. How are we institutionalizing things that seem so singularly drawn around your capacities? So I'd be interested to know at USC how that institutionalization looks. Clifford, I loved your presentation. It made me filled with despair for a variety of reasons of commiseration, but the peak despair is when you tell me that you, leading classicists in a leading classics department, cannot get rid of the sight translation exam. And that feels to me like the final question of our survival, is how we're going to be flexible and train cultures of alteration with these mechanisms of threshold passing. So what should we take from that fact, that we can't seem to break the back of that? And I have fought that battle too. I want to know how you interpret that as a historical artifact.
I'm going to take your question a little bit differently, because I think this is a question that often comes up, but I see it differently in terms of if I trace my field to be the history of Latinos or Chicanos in the United States, then there's a whole bunch of us. Vicky Ruiz, absolute public historian. We're both trained by Albert Gamadio at Stanford, absolute, now retired, absolute public historian. I've produced 45 PhDs. People like Genevieve Carpio, Margie Salazar-Porzio, the chief curator at the Smithsonian, Rosina Lozano at Princeton. I mean, I go on and on and on. people that have been here, like Monica Munoz Martinez. I mean, you're talking about a generation of people in my field that are absolutely committed to public history, right? And to me, that's the transformative approach. They are transforming institution by institution, graduate communities by graduate communities. I don't think of it as necessarily transforming my history department. Maybe to be institutionally at USC for 50 years, that's gonna have to happen, but that's great, but it ain't gonna be me. I do think that USC has to have a commitment, and basically all institutions have to have commitments to historians that do work in the local. Wherever that local is. It could be around their own university, it could be in other places, but those things are incredibly important, right? And it's one of the ways in which history departments, but then increasingly American studies, and basically the whole field of ethnic studies came into the academy. And we have to find ways to use that as a strength to really reform some of what we do in graduate education. We have presence in Boyle Heights, but Vicky Ruiz had presence in El Paso, in Davis. You know, the other people I'm talking about are doing the collecting work, are trying to transform every institution from the Smithsonian to Princeton to Cal State LA, right? I think a lot about the fact that I've done a lot of work for the AHA and the OAH on diversifying faculty. And I go back to this. Everybody wants institutionalized solutions. What really happens is that about 5 to 10 people in the country say, God damn it, I'm going to do it at my institution. And for a while there, it was only 5 of us at a variety of different institutions. And we used to call each other during the season where we were competing for the best PhD students. And we'd say, you know, somebody just missed here. But did you take them at this other place? You know, where else are they applying? How can we kind of do that? It was an incredible network of people who saw beyond their own institutional presence to the fact that we wanted to build a field. I did the numbers for the AHA at the beginning of the 21st century. And guess what? That's exactly what it was for African American history. Exactly. I'll give you an example. 1/3 of all history departments in this country, and of course, if you've got a PhD in this country, you usually had a history department giving PhDs. 1/3 in 2001 had never produced an African American PhD. And it was 10 to 15 institutions in the country that had produced the overwhelming number of African Americans with PhDs. And when you looked at those individual institutions, it was 2 or 3 faculty that had done almost all that heavy lifting. So I often tell this to the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, you just got to find the people who are doing the work now and make sure they get the support directly from you, because that's what's going to produce the numbers that you need. It's not, you know, a ton of institutional things. It's literally people saying, this is my priority in my career at my institution. And that's the way I think about a lot of these transformations, that if we want the change, we have to see who's doing it and then support them in that work, right? If you want to bring it to your campus because it's not there, you got to find who are the leaders of it nationally and say, I want to grow this group, right? I might steal one of them, but then I have to really keep it up and think about how to put it here. It's not that difficult if one realizes that what's been accomplished so far has been by a set of individual faculty who are passionate about what they do.
Yeah, I haven't got an optimistic answer for you except to say that something like the change is coming. You would have thought that an argument that the entrance to the field should be determined by something like a test of skills would be, that doesn't seem like a complicated argument. But yeah, no, it's, I think, among other things, when I've talked about this problem both to populations of graduate students at Chicago and at the Society for Classical Studies, it seems perfectly clear to everybody who's currently subject to the requirements that they should change. Now, there's this depressing feature about the way in which academic cultures recreate themselves, that it's possible that all of these young people, by the time they get to be professors, will change their song. But so part of what I want to say is change is coming. It comes astonishingly slowly. Probably will require demographic turnover, which is a problem I've talked about in the academic senate at the University of Chicago. There was much talk about diversity one day, and people said, well, my department's doing this and my department's doing that. I voted for X. And I felt compelled to respond. And there's actually a very, very fine literature on this, that the absolute #1 thing that the faculty in the United States can do as individuals to increase diversity is just retire. Just get out of the way. I mean, and all the despairing predictions, which were very sophisticated and very well done in the late 1990s when, mandatory retirement went away, were entirely accurate. Absolutely every prediction about the changing age of the professoriate, about the kind of, that everyone knew that was going to happen. And it does you no good if you say, I'm picking on another. Actually, I won't name them. But you could look around the institutions of New England. Look at history departments in New England. They're just, the average age of the professoriate is often in the late 60s. It's absolutely astonishing, and therefore white, and therefore male. And saying we're pushing our provost to give us a postdoc. Like, no, what you need to do is just retire. And I don't know how to make that happen. That's a complicated ethical problem as well. But it also suggests that the change will come.